Hi everyone, Teddy Baldassarre here, and in this video, we are going to be looking at how to build a 3-watch collection with 3 leading attainable watch brands and the different paths that you can take. Looking at Tissot, Hamilton, and Seiko. Now, there are many brands that you can consider in the attainable realm. I would say these are potentially the leading 3 that I would typically recommend for somebody if you're looking to spend past, say, a few $100 on a mechanical watch for the first time. We're gonna look at 3 different pillars within each of these collections and how this is gonna work. Have a sports pick, everyday pick, and then a dress pick. Also, before we jump into, when looking at building a 3-watch collection, this is not necessarily practical and something that I would always recommend to people. It's just kind of for the sake of having a conversation around different pillars. 3 is a nice number. It showcases 3 different styles of watches that I always talk about: dress watch, more of a diver or sports-oriented piece, and then also more of an everyday piece that you can wear in many different environments. I would probably advise against actually building a collection with just one brand, especially in the more attainable realm. I think this is the time where you can go ahead and test out different brands, see what you like, what you don't like. But if you are going to spend some money in this price segment, these are leading brands. I think some of the watches to consider here are also leading picks within this segment. Now, before we jump in here, I do want to also recommend, if you want a great jumping off point, in addition to what we're going to be talking about here, looking at some of the best watches in the industry, variety of price ranges, look at our 101 best watches for 2023. This is an article that's 10,000 words long. We're adding to it all the time. So link to that will be in the description down below, a great jumping off point for your research. So now for our first category here and for our first brand here, we're going to look at Tissot. So Tissot was the first Swiss watch that I ever owned. So I would recommend it to many people that are looking to own their first Swiss watch. I'd say it's probably one of the pillars of attainable Swiss watchmaking. And to begin here, we're looking at the sports category, where I would probably recommend, and this is more of something that can take a beating, something that's more robust. This is where I'd look at the C-Star 1000. Of course, the 2000 is an option for many people out there, but I think the 1000 is going to be more versatile for a wide variety of people. It's not so overbearing in terms of its wrist presence. 43 millimeters, not small, but I would say it wears smaller than that on wrist with the 49.6 millimeter lug to lug. Thickness is very reasonable. Powermatic 80 movement on the inside, 80-hour power reserve, and 300 meters of water resistance is more than enough for 99.9999999% of people out there. Now, dive watches is not necessarily something that Tissot has really strived to perfect. There's a lot of other great Swiss brands that do a lot of great things in dive watches, but if you just want something no nonsense that's very versatile, that's really where the Tissot C-Star comes into play. So now for our everyday category. Now, this is the part within looking at Tissot's collection that gets very difficult. You have essentially 2 of the leading releases from a Swiss watchmaking perspective in the last 5 years. You have the Tissot Gentleman, which to this day is the most views I've ever obtained on a singular review of one watch on the channel. So that is saying something. That watch clearly resonates with many people out there and needs to be considered. The other is the Tissot PRX, which has become another fixture within the attainable watchmaking realm that now probably needs no further introduction. I will probably just split this one right down the middle, and then I will also reference a video where I compare both of these watches with one another. Are they necessarily similar? No, but I think there are some things that get lost on people when looking at what is the better watch for them. The PRX, obviously more sporty and will lean into the integrated sports trend of the era. You have more variety when it comes to the different dial colors. The bracelet is much better on the PRX in comparison to the Gentleman. The Gentleman, I would say, is adequate but not great for the money compared to the PRX, which is more class leading for the dollar amount. The Gentleman, I do think, is a more versatile watch. If you pair this with pretty much any strap, it's going to look the part. And I think it also could be dressed up more appropriately. So it kind of depends on what you're going to do with what you want from a everyday style watch. If you are leaning into a direction that's going to cause you to want to dress up more, that's where I think the Gentleman will come into play. Also considering here that it does have a higher rated Powermatic 80 movement in terms of the specifications. So this one is actually coming with the silicone hairspring on the inside, so a different variation of the C07 family that I also think is lost on people when considering these 2 different watches. There's more than just the aesthetics of these pieces that is separating them, hence why also the dollar amount for the Gentleman is a little higher. And then for the dress category, closing out this trio, I think you have 2 primary options that I would recommend. One is a long-standing collection, and actually was a surprise to me hearing that this is actually one of the best-selling global collections from Tissot, the Lilac, referencing the city in which Tissot is located. But the other collection that I'll also mention is the Chemin de Tourelle. This is a brand new refresh collection from Tissot, and I think it looks great, and they did a nice job redesigning this, and would probably be my choice of the 2 if you are especially leaning into something like the PRX. It is a little more contemporary in its approach. approach. Both have some different dial colors to choose from, but looking at the Chemin de Trail, just because it is a newer creation from the brand, or updated creation from the brand, 39 millimeter now being an available size, which I think is a great win. 11.5 millimeters in thickness, 43.8 millimeter lug to lug, an adequate 50 meters of water resistance, Powermatic 80 movement on the inside, and the finishing on the Chemin de Trail, both on the case as well as the hands, is very good. And I think this is one element that gets lost when you're just looking at press photos of brands, of new watches. Look at the case finish. Not to say that it's extraordinary, something you'll rival that of a $5,000 watch, but of the price segment under $1,000, it's very well done. Different finishes on the different angles. You can see the directional graining of the brushing on the case sides, some of the lugs, additional facets. And then on the hands, one element that I really like, this is a feature that is one of the main things I like about something like the Vacheron Traditionnelle. Not to say that this is done to the same degree, but it is the same type of idea. You have a center facet on the hands, and then it's splitting up over. On one side, you have the polished side. The other is gonna be more of this blasted effect. It creates this wonderful contrast off the dial, and on the blue one, it especially pops. So now from Tissot, we head to Japan and look at Seiko. Now, Seiko is probably the toughest brand to do this for, just because of how many tiers there are just within Seiko. You look at Tissot, for the most part, everything is between like $500 and say $1,000 apart from their chronographs, which makes sense. But then you're looking at Seiko and you're talking about watches that start around $200, and then you can go up to as high as $5,000 for some of their higher end luxe collection. I'm going to be focusing, of course, more on the attainable end here. I'll just throw out some recommendations for the sports category. One, of course, you have to mention just all the Seiko 5 sports models. That's certainly a place to go if you want to go that route, save the most amount of money, get a great bang for buck. You also could look at the chronographs, the speed timers, which have become very popular, of course, referencing and looking very close to some 1960s, 70s chronographs from Seiko, but also in addition to that, resembling maybe something like the Rolex Daytona in certain instances. And then for the stretch picks, you also have something like the SPB 143, which is probably one of my favorite dive watches that Seiko currently makes. Some people have some reluctance to look in the direction of that watch just because of the price and where it sits for Seiko, but I am on the bandwagon for that watch, but I can understand where people are coming from there if they've never handled it. But I would say probably the best of both worlds in terms of places to go would be looking at, say, something like the Samurai collection as well as the Turtle collection. Now, these are models that are not necessarily called this officially by the brand. They're more of just a name that has been developed by collectors of Seiko. If you know anything about Seiko collectors, they certainly love giving nicknames to many of the watches that are being collected. These are just a couple recommendations, but there are so many models to get lost in. You could go JDM models, you can look at simply limited editions. As far as the eye could see, here are two that I'd recommend from the Samurai as well as the Turtle collection. One you have is the SRPE 37, and then from the Turtle side, you have the SRPD 43. The SRPE 37 is more of the higher end Samurai type of variety, texturized surface on the dial, 43.8 millimeter case, but a lug to lug of 48.7 millimeters. Just for context, that's less than a millimeter longer in the lug to lug dimension than a Tudor Black Bay 58. So this is not going to wear near the size that is being presented by this watch. 200 meters of water resistance, ISO compliant dive watch, 12.8 millimeters in thickness, 4R series of movements on the inside. So a lot to like with this watch. Also a great thing about this piece compared to some of the other watches below, as well as some of the other watches in kind of the same alignment as this one, you're also getting a sapphire crystal, which is quite nice. The Turtles have even more of a compact lug to lug, but also do have a wider, more cushioned case, not as angular as the Samurai. So they just have a slightly different silhouette. 13.2 millimeters in thickness, 200 meters of water resistance, also an ISO compliant dive watch, and then does come with this Cyclops on the crystal. If you're into the modding community, you can actually remove it. I've seen people do it quite easily, so that is also a viable option to you if you do want to go in that direction. I think these look great. The Turtle collection is one of the most iconic case silhouettes from the attainable diving tier without question. So now for this next watch, this is probably a watch that has gained increased value in the market just because of what has happened with many of the surrounding competitors with their prices going up, and that is the SPB 121. If you're familiar with the SARB 017, that was a model that was beloved by many, then started to get pushed away, discontinued. This is the now modern contemporary form of that watch. And has many people that will absolutely love it, adore it. It's not for everybody. It does have some polarizing elements, even for myself. The compass bezel, 2 crowns on the case side. It's perhaps not going to be the watch for me from Seiko, but for so many, I understand why this watch works. It is a no-brainer across the board if you're just trying to get value for money from Seiko from a couple sides. One, it's very robust. 200 meters of water resistance, sapphire crystal, also getting some different dial colors if you do want to go into a different direction. You have the baby alpinist models, you have some other alpinist heritage models that you can go for in addition, which for my own personal taste would probably be my choice, but this one is really the best seller. The other element that makes these watches, I think, more compelling is going to be the movement on the inside. The 6R35 is the 70-hour power reserve offering from Seiko, still operating at 3 Hertz. And if you look across the board, they're sticking this in watches that are around $2,000. And this is the entry position really where you're starting to see this become available. So where this sits compared to some of the others, much more compelling. It's a nice movement. Some will be maybe sticklers about the range of deviation that it occupies in comparison to something like Tissot or what's later to come with Hamilton. But there is unmistakable charm that comes with the Seiko Alpinist collection. And then for one of the easiest picks of the day, I would say this is the definitive dress watch for around $500, if not less. $300 to $500, you're looking to spend that amount of money. I'd go with the Seiko Cocktail Time. They're safe. They're well done, well finished. The dials have their own personality, which is not usually the case for a dress watch, especially in this price range. If you look around at the rest of the market for pretty much any dress watch under $1,000, very generic is typically, or safe in its approaches. Of course there are exceptions, but if you look at the wide variety available to you, many of them are going to be very plain in their approach. This is not the case with the Cocktail Time. The imagery used to define these watches, the rib finish of the dial, all look spectacular. The one we're showcasing here is the SRPB 43. Very muted, understated, but still pops where necessary, versatile as can be. There are different case and dial options to choose from these. This particular one at 40.5 millimeters does have more of this curvaceous bubbled effect with the case, 47.6 millimeters with the lug to lug. So wearing rather true to the size, but it is a lot of dial for these watches, especially with that dome nature. 4R35 movement on the inside, and just, again, a no-brainer when it comes to a dress watch in this price tier. And now for our final brand here, we have Hamilton. And Hamilton, I would say, complements Tissot in many ways. A bit more of a military approach, utilitarian approach to many of their designs, and history to go along with it. If you're looking for a field watch, a watch also when it comes to chronographs, one of the leaders, historically speaking, in this price range. Now, to begin, let's look at a sports watch, and I struggle with Hamilton sometimes because, of course, you have like the Frogmans, you have other diver-oriented watches, but really what they're more known for from their history is going to be their chronographs. If you look at the chronomatics from the late 1960s, 70s, right around that turn, they had a lot to contribute to the early production of automatic chronographs, and they had that history to really rely on, which many brands, if you look at the other brands that are included in that, you're talking about brands like Heuer, Breitling, true leaders when it comes to this world. Zenith, another one just to name. Hamilton was a leader in the world of automatic chronographs in the turn of the 1960s to the 70s. So these watches pull directly from their past in terms of resembling much of the chronomatics, coming with a manual caliber on the inside, a fully integrated Valjoux caliber that is modified, 7753 base, getting an extended power reserve in the process. Still actually with the thickness department, not as thick as some other watches that are containing Valjoux calibers, just over 14 millimeters in thickness, 40 millimeters with the case size, which I think is more than wearable on the wrist, 100 meters of water resistance, pretty compact lug to lug, all things considered. Might wear like a 40.5 to 41 on wrist, depending if you wear it on the bracelet or not. But this is probably where I would highlight when looking at Hamilton, if you're looking at the sports category, and just honestly a chronograph in the entry-level perspective for a mechanical Swiss-made chronograph, this is going to be one of the definitive leaders. And now for the everyday category, this comes with little to no surprise if you know Hamilton, and that is going to be looking at the field collection. Specifically, I'm going to look at the Murph. Over the last few years, I was honestly thinking that Hamilton watches were almost underpriced, especially for those mechanical options you can get under $500. that is actually remarkable value, especially if you compare it to something like Tissot, where it was being $150 less than, say, like a PRX. Pretty crazy to see. With all the changes in the market, there has been a price increase on some of their entry-level options, making something like the Murph a bit more compelling for reasons of, one, you're getting a 38mm case with also a more compact lug-to-lug, which I know is something, in looking at the comments, people really like to see, and it was one of the main draws to the Murph. It is more elegant in its approach with its cathedral-style hands, relatively thin on wrist despite the automatic movement on the inside, 80-hour power reserve, and 100 meters of water resistance, which, if you're looking at the hand winding options at that attainable tier, only going to be 50 meters of water resistance. I think a lot of this together helps the Murph in its positioning, both within Hamilton's very mighty field collection, but also as being one of the leaders in terms of releases in the past 12 months. And now for our final watch here in the dress category, we have the Intramatic Champagne. This is one of those sleeper picks from Hamilton that's one of my personal favorites, the watch I really do love from them. And a couple reasons being, one is just going to be how this one wears, how it's kind of overlooked as well, and that dial color is special. If you look at this, it's not necessarily like a salmon dial, it's not really like a copper dial, it's a weird kind of combination of both of these things, but it is simply beautiful. They describe it as champagne. I guess that's a realistic type of description of this watch. 10.2mm in thickness, 43.9mm lug to lug, still getting at least 50 meters of water resistance, and for a dress watch that also has some casual intrigue, I think that's good to see. One other peculiar thing about this watch is it's one of the rare instances within Hamilton's collection where you're not getting that 80-hour power reserve and also the change in the regulator setup for their movements. This actually has an ETA 2892, which is the kind of more thin, refined base for a lot of these three-hand style watches. But this is, of course, is not a three-hand watch, a two-hand watch. There's no second hand on this watch, which is another interesting concept when looking at this design. Maybe something you didn't notice right away until looking at it, but there's something very clean about the way this watch looks. And with that dial, I think this is the best of that Intramatic collection in terms of separating from the crowd. But all right, guys, that is my video here today looking at these three brands, how to build a three-watch collection. This is by no means what I would say is the definitive guide to these brands in terms of all they have available to you. It's a very simple way to look at it, but figured this would be kind of a fun way to package looking at some of the brands, how to think about it. I like also the element of three. There's just something powerful. It's my favorite number. 3 is my favorite number, and it just is a nice way to look at completing something. I think if you have three watches in general, you're pretty much covered in every scenario if you're following it in this type of protocol, especially depending on your lifestyle. It's all dependent on your lifestyle. But all right, guys, if you did like the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon. If you want us to do more of this in the future with other brands, please leave suggestions down below in the comments if you want us to continue this and kind of navigate this path. I'd love to do it, and I think there's plenty of brands to do this with. Also, definitely check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. How we're able to fund all of our productions, from things of me just sitting right here to visiting the JLC factory, to going overseas, traveling around the world, how we're able to afford all this, put all the effort into the content is through selling watches on our site. We're not taking money from the brands to do this. We're all self-funded here, so really would appreciate the support. If you're in the market for a watch, we know you can buy a watch anywhere, but we'd love to have your business. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.